The night I collapsed on the living room floor, gasping for air, I looked up at my children, Michael, Emily, and David. I thought they would rush to save me. Instead, they stood there, whispering about my money, my house, my will, as if I were already gone. My son Michael smirked, saying, "Maybe it's better if he doesn't make it through the night." That moment burned into my soul. They thought my last breath was their freedom, but what they didn't know was that their betrayal would give me a reason to rise again, stronger than ever. Before I take you deeper into my story, please like and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. And let us know which beautiful place you're watching this from. My name is Richard Walker, and I spent my entire life building a home, a business, and a family I thought would protect me in my final years. I worked 2 jobs in my 20s, built a small construction company in my 30s, and by the time I reached 60, I had properties, savings, and everything a man could dream of. But what mattered most to me wasn't the wealth. It was my children. Michael, Emily, and David were my pride, my reason to keep going through every hardship. I gave them everything. Michael had the best schools. Emily traveled the world on my dime, and David, and the youngest, was spoiled with every comfort. I believed that by giving them a life better than mine, they would grow up grateful, kind, and respectful. I thought they'd stand by me when my strength faded. But life has a cruel way of showing you the truth about the people you love most. Happened one autumn evening. My chest tightened as though a hammer had struck me from within. I collapsed on the living room floor, struggling for breath, my vision blurring. I looked up, reaching out my hand, desperate for help. I expected to see my children running toward me. Instead, I heard whispers. Michael's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "If Dad's gone tonight, the house is ours. No more waiting." Emily sighed coldly. "It's about time. He's been dragging this out for years." David stood, silent, eyes lowered, but his silence hurt me just as deeply. Lying there, helpless on the floor, I realized the cruel truth. My children weren't waiting to save me. They were waiting for me to die. That night changed everything. I survived, but not as the father they once knew. From that moment, I swore, if they wanted me buried, I would rise and make them pay for every breath they took for granted. After that night, I spent weeks in the hospital. My body was weak, my chest ached, and each breath felt like a battle. But my mind was sharper than ever. I watched Michael, Emily, and David from my hospital bed. They visited, but not out of concern. No, they came to check their inheritance, to see if their father was finally close to death. Their smiles were hollow, their voices polite, but empty. Every word they spoke felt like a blade. Every forced laugh a reminder of how little they truly cared. I realized then that survival alone wouldn't be enough. I needed a plan, a way to reclaim my dignity, my assets, and make them feel the consequences of their betrayal. I knew I couldn't confront them head-on yet. They would never take me seriously. They would laugh at my weakness. So I decided to hide my strength, to let them believe I was fragile and powerless. Once discharged, I returned home. My children continued their usual patterns. Michael taking charge of the house as if he owned it, Emily hosting lavish parties to flaunt what she thought was her fortune, and David quietly siphoning money from minor investments I had made for him. I observed everything. Every careless word, every smug gesture, every sign of arrogance. I cataloged their greed, their betrayal, every action that would fuel my revenge. Then I reached out to old friends who had once been partners in my business, George Miller and Helen Crawford. Loyal people who respected me, who remembered the man I was before they became corrupt with wealth. With their help, I started untangling the web my children had woven. Bank accounts, property deeds, legal documents. Everything was quietly secured in ways they could never imagine. I also documented their betrayals, secretly recording conversations, gathering proof of their schemes to sell off my properties, and noting their cruel remarks during my illness. Each piece of evidence added fuel to the fire burning inside me. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice, about teaching them a lesson they would never forget. Every night, as I lay awake, I reminded myself of the moment on the living room floor. the day they chose greed over their own father's life. That image, that betrayal, became my driving force. They thought they had me defeated. They thought their father was powerless. But by the time they realized the truth, it would be too late. I had survived my children's cruelty, and now, it was time for them to face the consequences of taking my last breath for granted. Weeks passed and my children continued their charade of respect, never suspecting that the man they had dismissed as weak was quietly plotting their downfall. I watched them carefully, learning their routines, their secrets, and their arrogance. Michael, always greedy and loud, flaunted his authority over the house, demanding I sign documents I hadn't even seen. Emily, elegant and manipulative, invited her friends and influential people over, parading what she thought was her future fortune. David, the silent shadow, quietly moved money around my investments, believing I didn't notice. I realized I needed to strike subtly at first, to shake them psychologically before any legal or financial moves. A father's revenge isn't just about reclaiming what's yours. It's about making those who betrayed you feel the weight of every wrong choice they made. I started with small things. A missing document here, a misfiled account there, all carefully orchestrated so that Michael began doubting his control. "Where did that deed go?" he muttered one morning, eyes narrowing as he rifled through papers he thought were his. I pretended confusion, shaking my head and whispering, "I have no idea. Maybe it's misplaced." I let his panic grow, slowly, feeding on his arrogance. Emily noticed the subtle cracks too. Invitations she had sent out for her high society gathering arrived late or not at all. Guests whispered about minor mishaps, and she blamed the staff, not realizing her father was behind every delay. Each embarrassment, each subtle disruption was a reminder that she was not in control, and her facade of superiority began to falter. Meanwhile, David's silence became his undoing. I left hints of his shady financial maneuvers around, safe, copies of emails and records that pointed directly to him. I didn't accuse him yet. I let him stew in the fear of exposure, his guilt gnawing at him quietly. He began sleeping poorly, constantly checking his phone and accounts, aware that something was wrong but unable to identify it. During this time, I also reconnected with George Miller, my old business partner, and Helen Crawford, a trusted friend. Together we worked quietly to create legal barriers and hidden trusts that would ensure the children could never claim my wealth. Every property they thought they could inherit was now under secure arrangements, untouchable, even if they tried to act recklessly. The real turning point came one evening. Emily came to me smiling falsely and said, "Dad, everything's fine now, right? You don't have to worry about anything." I looked at her, a quiet smile on my lips, and said, "I always worry, Emily. That's what it means to care, unlike some people." Her smile faltered. She glanced at Michael and David, who were in the room, and noticed the subtle tension I had seeded. Suddenly, the house that once belonged to them felt uncertain, unstable, as if the very walls knew they had underestimated me. It was intoxicating, not just the idea of taking back what was mine, but the satisfaction of watching them question themselves, their choices, and their morality. The fear was creeping in slowly, invisibly, but I knew it would eventually consume them. I spent nights planning the next phase, public exposure of their greed, legal maneuvers that would leave them bankrupt, and subtle manipulations to destroy the bonds of trust they thought existed between them. By the time they realized the extent of my planning, there would be no escape. They had taken my last breath for granted. They had believed their father was weak, helpless, and ready to be discarded. But every whisper, every missing document, every tiny disruption was a reminder. I was alive. I was watching, and their reckoning was coming. As I lay in my study that night, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, I whispered to myself, "You thought I was done, Michael, Emily, David, but I am just beginning." The day I had been waiting for finally arrived. With George and Helen's help, I had meticulously prepared every detail. Hidden trusts, legal barriers, and documented evidence of Michael, Emily, and David's betrayals were ready to be unveiled. It wasn't enough to reclaim my wealth. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, to see the consequences of taking their father's life and trust for granted. I invited them to the house under the guise of discussing final arrangements. Michael arrived first, arrogantly pacing the living room, confident that I was still the weak elderly man they had scorned. Emily followed, her polished smile hiding unease, and David trailed silently, eyes flicking nervously toward me. "Everything will be as you expect, Dad?" Emily asked, forcing a light tone. I looked at her calmly, my expression neutral, my words deliberate. "I've made some changes," I said slowly. "You might not find everything as you left it." Michael's confidence wavered as I handed George the first documents. The once powerful son leaned closer, squinting at legal forms that immediately restricted access to my properties. What is this?" he stammered. "It's exactly what you deserve," I replied, my voice steady. "You believed my last breath would be yours to control. You were wrong." Emily's smile faltered as I revealed emails and recordings proving her attempts to sell off my assets behind my back. David's face turned pale when he saw the evidence of his financial manipulations. Their arrogance crumbled under the weight of proof. "You thought I was powerless," I continued, my eyes locking with each of theirs. "You forgot that every action has consequences. I may have appeared weak, but I've been preparing this moment for months. You took my trust, my life, my last breath. Now you will face the truth." For the first time, silence filled the room. No arguing, no excuses. Only the realization that their father, the man they had tried to discard, had outsmarted them entirely. I let the moment linger, watching their panic grow. Pride, greed, and betrayal were being stripped from them piece by piece, replaced by the shock of seeing the father they had mocked rise above them with precision and strength. And in that silence, I knew this was only the beginning. The reckoning had begun, and they would never forget the cost of underestimating Richard Walker. The tension in the room was palpable. Michael, Emily, and David had begun to grasp the full extent of what they had lost, yet they still clung to hope, as though pleading could undo months of planning. I could see it in their eyes: desperation, fear, and a faint glimmer of regret. But I was no longer the weak man they had mocked. I was a father who had been pushed beyond the limits of patience and forgiveness. "I gave you everything," I began, my voice calm but unwavering. "Education, opportunities, comfort, all the things I sacrificed my youth to provide. And what did I get in return? Betrayal, disrespect, mockery. You took my last breath for granted, and now you will understand what that means." Michael's lips trembled. "Dad, we didn't mean—" "You didn't mean?" I interrupted sharply. "You left me to suffer while you counted my possessions. You believed my weakness was your freedom. But freedom comes with responsibility, and you have none." Emily tried to maintain her composure, but her hands shook as she looked around, realizing the guests I had invited, George, Helen, and my legal team, were all witnesses to her shame. Every secret, every scheme she had hidden was now exposed. David's silence was even more damning, guilt etched deeply across his face. Then I delivered the final blow. The properties, the accounts, the businesses, every asset they had assumed would one day belong to them, were legally secured elsewhere. Not a dollar, not a deed, not a single thing remained under their control. Their empire of assumed entitlement had crumbled before their very eyes. "You thought my old age made me powerless," I said, walking slowly toward them. "But what you failed to see was that your betrayal had made me stronger. I survived. I planned. And now, justice has been served." The room fell into stunned silence. Michael sank into the nearest chair, defeated. Emily's pride broke into tears, and David finally looked up, his eyes hollow and filled with regret. None of them spoke. Words would not undo what had been done. Stepped back and let the weight of the moment settle. This was not cruelty. It was balance. A lesson that betrayal, no matter how cleverly hidden, always carries consequences. As I left the room that evening, I felt a strange peace. My revenge was complete, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and my life. Michael, Emily, and David would forever remember the day they underestimated their father, the day their choices cost them everything. And I, Richard Walker, would never again allow anyone to take my last breath for granted. The days after the confrontation were strangely quiet. The house, once filled with noise, arrogance, and the careless chatter of my children, now felt hollow. Michael, Emily, and David had retreated into their shame, each dealing with the consequences of their betrayal in their own way. For the first time, I saw the stark reality of what their choices had cost them. Not just wealth, but respect, trust, and the love of their father. I spent my mornings walking through the house I had built with my own hands. Every room reminded me of the sacrifices I had made for my children, and yet I felt no anger toward myself for giving them all I could. My anger, my grief, had been transformed into purpose. I had survived their cruelty, and I had ensured they would never forget the cost of betrayal. George Miller and Helen Crawford visited regularly, offering their support and quietly ensuring that my legal arrangements remained intact. Together, we monitored the aftermath of the exposure, ensuring that Michael, Emily, and David could not reverse the changes I had made. The satisfaction was not just in taking back what was mine. It was in knowing that justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. The children attempted to communicate with me, sending messages and emails filled with excuses, apologies, and desperate pleas. I read them silently, feeling a strange mix of pity and satisfaction. I did not respond. Their words could not erase the choices they had made. Their betrayal had created a rift too deep to repair. I had offered them guidance and life, but they had turned my generosity into contempt. In the evenings, I often sat alone by the fireplace, reflecting on the life I had lived. I thought about the father I had been, loving, giving, patient, and the man I had become, calculating, determined, unyielding. Revenge had not consumed me. It had refined me. It had allowed me to reclaim my dignity and show my children that every action carries weight. They had taken my last breath for granted, but I had taken control of the life I still had. I also thought about the lessons I would leave behind. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those we love, but strength and resilience can rise from the ashes of despair. I had survived, planned, and executed a reckoning that ensured justice, not cruelty. My children would remember this day for the rest of their lives, and I would never again doubt my own worth. As I looked out the window at the golden sunset, I whispered to myself, I am Richard Walker. I lived, I sacrificed, and I survived. And those who tried to discard me have learned a truth they will never forget. The house was silent, the fire burned low, and I felt a profound peace. My revenge was complete, but more importantly, I had reclaimed something far greater than wealth or control. I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and my life. And that, I realized, was the ultimate victory. For a father who had been betrayed, that victory was sweeter than any fortune, and I knew that at last justice had been served. Months passed since that fateful day. The house, once alive with the noise of entitlement and careless chatter, remained silent. Michael, Emily, and David had retreated from the world they once believed was theirs. The exposure of their greed, the public and legal humiliation, and the sudden loss of control had changed them. I heard whispers from neighbors, family, friends, and even former colleagues, rumors of their struggles, failures, and fractured relationships. It was a quiet, undeniable proof that actions have consequences, and betrayal is never forgotten. Michael, once bold and brash, now wandered from meeting to meeting, unable to secure contracts or trust from anyone. His arrogance had blinded him, and now the world reflected his own greed back at him. Emily's reputation in her social circles crumbled. Invitations vanished, her friends distanced themselves, and her carefully constructed image of elegance and power shattered. David, who had silently tried to profit from my weakness, found himself alone, unable to manipulate anyone, burdened by guilt he could no longer ignore. I watched them from a distance, quietly satisfied, but not gloating. Revenge had never been about cruelty for its own sake. It was about justice, teaching them that taking a father's life, love, and trust for granted carries a cost. I reminded myself often, anger and resentment are fleeting, but wisdom and justice endure. During this time, I reflected deeply on my own life. Surviving their betrayal had taught me lessons about resilience, patience, and the nature of human greed. It wasn't wealth or power that made life meaningful. It was dignity, love for those who truly cared, and the ability to rise above cruelty. I spent more time with George Miller and Helen Crawford, enjoying the companionship of those who had proven loyal when loyalty mattered most. Together we laughed, shared stories of the past, and planned quiet, meaningful projects, helping local families, donating to causes that mattered, and rebuilding connections I had neglected during the years I devoted to my children. Yet even in this peace, I knew the shadow of my children's betrayal lingered. Their actions had left a permanent mark, one that could never fully heal. But that shadow also reminded me of my own strength, the strength to survive, endure, and reclaim life on my terms. Months passed since that fateful day. The house, once alive with the noise of entitlement and careless chatter, remained silent. Michael, Emily, and David had retreated from the world they once believed was theirs. The exposure of their greed, the public and legal humiliation, and the sudden loss of control had changed them. I heard whispers from neighbors, family friends, and even former colleagues, rumors of their struggles, failures, and fractured relationships. It was a quiet, undeniable proof that actions have consequences and betrayal is never forgotten. Michael, once bold and brash, now wandered from meeting to meeting, unable to secure contracts or trust from anyone. His arrogance had blinded him, and now the world reflected his own greed back at him. Emily's reputation in her social circles crumbled. Invitations vanished, her friends distanced themselves, and her carefully constructed image of elegance and power shattered. David, who had silently tried to profit from my weakness, found himself alone, unable to manipulate anyone, burdened by guilt he could no longer ignore. I watched them from a distance, quietly satisfied, but not gloating. Revenge had never been about cruelty for its own sake. It was about justice, teaching them that taking a father's life, love, and trust for granted carries a cost. I reminded myself often, anger and resentment are fleeting, but wisdom and justice endure. During this time, I reflected deeply on my own life. Surviving their betrayal had taught me lessons about resilience, patience, and the nature of human greed. It wasn't wealth or power that made life meaningful. It was dignity, love for those who truly cared, and the ability to rise above cruelty. I spent more time with George Miller and Helen Crawford, enjoying the companionship of those who had proven loyal when loyalty mattered most. Together we laughed, shared stories of the past, and planned quiet, meaningful projects, helping local families, donating to causes that mattered, and rebuilding connections I had neglected during the years I devoted to my children. Yet even in this peace, I knew the shadow of my children's betrayal lingered. Their actions had left a permanent mark, one that could never fully heal. But that shadow also reminded me of my own strength, the strength to survive, endure, and reclaim life on my terms. The years after my confrontation with Michael, Emily, and David were quiet. But in that quiet, I discovered a peace I had never truly known. The house, once brimming with laughter, arrogance, and careless chatter, now held a calm I could finally appreciate. My children had retreated into the consequences of their actions, their lives marked by the bitter lessons they could not undo. They had taken my last breath for granted, believing that their father's love and patience were endless, that my weakness made me powerless. But the truth, which they had learned far too late, was that betrayal awakens a strength even the most underestimated parent can wield. I often walked through the rooms of my home, each corner a reminder of sacrifice and devotion. I remembered the early mornings when I rose before dawn to work, the long nights I spent building a business from nothing, and the countless moments I put my own needs aside for theirs. And I remembered the night I collapsed in the living room, gasping for air, my children whispering about my possessions instead of my life. That memory, once a raw wound, had become the fire that fueled every careful step of my revenge, every quiet plan executed in secret. Justice had been served, not through anger or malice, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Michael's arrogance had been shattered, Emily's pride humbled, and David's quiet deceit exposed. They had lost not only wealth and status, but also the sense of entitlement they had carried their entire lives. The lesson had been delivered, and the message was unmistakable. Betrayal carries a cost. The love and trust of a father are not to be taken lightly, and those who do so must face the consequences. Even in the midst of this justice, I found my own life renewed. I spent more time with George Miller and Helen Crawford, the friends who had proven loyal when loyalty mattered most. Together we rebuilt not just material things but connections, communities, and purpose. I helped families in need, supported local initiatives, and quietly ensured that the legacy I left behind was one of integrity, not just revenge. I realized that life's true value lies not in possessions or control but in dignity, in meaningful relationships, and in the ability to rise above cruelty. My children attempted to reach out, sending messages filled with excuses and apologies, pleading for forgiveness they did not deserve. I read them silently, feeling neither anger nor gloating, only the steady satisfaction of knowing the lessons had been learned. Words could not undo the choices they had made. Their betrayal had left scars that could not be erased, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience within me. As I watched the sunset from my study one evening, I whispered to myself, I am Richard Walker. I lived, I sacrificed, I endured, and I reclaimed my life. Those who betrayed me have learned their lesson, and I have finally found peace. Revenge had not been about cruelty. It had been about balance, dignity, and justice. A father's strength, even when pushed to the edge, is formidable. And in that strength I found closure, a profound sense of satisfaction, and the ultimate truth. Even when betrayed by one's own blood, a man can rise, reclaim his life, and leave a lasting lesson that will never be forgotten. To everyone listening today, remember to value the people who stand by you and never underestimate the strength of those you try to wrong. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. Your support means the world.